Hey there, welcome to Beauty at Work. This is the second episode in our discussion on how beauty works to shape our brains, the spaces we inhabit, and the communities that we build. If you haven't listened to the first episode yet, please check it out before you continue with this one. The discussion was part of our International Symposium on Beauty at Work that we held in Washington, D.C. in May 2023, and featured a conversation between four panelists: Dr. Anjan Chatterjee from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Julio Bermudez from the Catholic University of America, Dr. Sheri Parks of the University of Maryland, and Pallavi Dean, founder of the design firm Roar in Dubai, UAE. The panel was moderated by journalist Christine Emba from The Atlantic. You can find the video of our discussion in the show notes, and I want to thank the sponsors of our event: Templeton Religion Trust, the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California, the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, Archbridge Institute, and the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America.
It's really interesting what you said about value and beauty. And I was telling you this earlier. I think my husband is the most gorgeous man in the world. I think my best friend is a supermodel.
Is he listening? Is that why you're doing this?
Love you, baby.
This is the seduction part is happening right here.
Getting 20 years later, right? I still think he's gorgeous. I think my children are divine. But that's just because I love them. And, my husband will always say to me, he's just like, you only find this person good looking because you like them. Anjan, can you tell me what's wrong with me? Like, why is it that I just find nice people beautiful?
I think that's a nice thing, actually.
It's a lovely thing, but that goes back to what Anjan was saying about value and beauty, because no matter how beautiful someone is, if they were not a nice person, I don't think I would find them attractive.
Well, what's wrong with you is you're human. So one of the things that we've been finding is that, and this goes back to the seduction of beauty, the shadowy side of it, and not to suggest there's anything shadowy about you and your husband, but there is something that social psychologists have talked about a fair amount, which is the beauty is good stereotype. And the phenomena is that attractive people get all sorts of unearned advantages in life. People who are attractive tend to be hired more easily, are given higher pay. Attractive people, when they need help, many more people are willing to help them. Students who are attractive are given higher grades unless it's a standardized test. And so this is what I mean by a kind of conflation where attractive people are also thought to be more intelligent, more trustworthy, more competent, and so on. And we've been finding an unfortunate corollary to that, which is when people have minor facial anomalies. So this can be scars, it can be burns, it can be developmental abnormalities. There's an implicit view that such people are less competent, less trustworthy, less intelligent. We have worked out some of the neural basis of this, and we think there is a very big cultural component to this. So we've studied a hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania and find that they don't make the same kind of stereotypic judgments that we have found in every other population we've studied. And just to give you an example of how this is reified by culture, again, taking a lesson from Pallavi, by raise of hands, how many of you in this audience have seen movies that are either The Lion King, a Bond movie, or a movie in the Marvel universe? Just raise your hands. Each of those worlds show villains with facial disfigurements. In The Lion King, right, the only character that doesn't even get a name is Scar. So this is the message we are giving our 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. And once you see this, I promise you, if you see this, you will not be able to unsee it. Every time you turn on something, right now, Mother is one of the most popular shows on Netflix. Same thing. So I think the way our culture also pushes this idea is really quite profound.
So, Sheri, there must be a social justice component here. I mean, have you thought about this in your work?
Well, first I want to talk about squirrels, because we had an example here.
Let's bring it back to squirrels.
Squirrels are fluffy and they were brought in to suggest empathy. And if you've ever lived around a squirrel, a little block from a state park, they're vicious. They're carnivores. And so the meaning we have built around these fluffy vermins, which is what people from Europe often call them, is because they're cute. And so we do that all the time. And one aspect is I think a little different than what you're asking is Anjan's work, I think, informs race and how we perceive race and who gets to be beautiful. And of course, you and I have lived through a period where that has been, and Beyonce is a lot of it, but what is allowed to be beautiful has changed. When I was young and wanted to pierce my ears, my mother said, I don't want you to pierce your ears because then you cannot be Miss America. It was kind of her way of, I was never going to be Miss America. And I said, they don't let us be Miss America. Well, of course, there have been several, I think most of them in the last 10 years have been women of color. And so what's interesting about that is that it does and can change. And that's what I mean by meaning structures that people bring and communicate so that my 28-year-old, who is gorgeous, even by Anjan's standards, knows it, right? It doesn't question it, kind of, thank you very much, and goes on her way. And so what people bring to it then can be used. So right now, you mentioned the Natural Dye Initiative. And what that is a multi-part project where we introduce farming of indigo, which is for dye, which is very expensive and very rare at this point. In the United States, it was a slave crop. So we're reintroducing the propagation of indigo to Black farmers in Baltimore City and Maryland Eastern Shore, South Carolina, on some of the same land that slaves grew indigo. Now this summer, North Carolina and Virginia are coming on. Then the indigo comes back to Baltimore, where returning citizens. Now notice, this is an art-based project. Where returning citizens then hang it to dry, and we have the funding to mill it into dye and sell it. At the same time, we're training artists and makers, and we're giving them the indigo because it's expensive and rare, and teaching them how to dye things with it. And we're creating an online marketplace where they can sell it. Mm-hmm. So notice here, beauty is not separated in any way. It's woven through the entire process. Indigo, given to the conversation last night, is holy, is sacred all over the world. Starts in India, moves through Asia. And we're not proselytizing, but we're honoring that, partly because the community made us. So we do these workshops that are free, where we take indigo vats on horse-drawn carts into underserved neighborhoods. And we teach them about how to do it. And then we hand out T-shirts, and they dye their T-shirts. We teach them how to do West African designs on their T-shirts. And what adults began to report to us was that they felt different after they did the indigo. And we give them, indigo stains your hands, and we were giving them gloves. And we noticed that almost everybody was taking their gloves off so they could plunge their hands into the dye. And they were leaving with their dyed shirts, but they're also leaving with their dyed hands. Those of you who've seen Daughters of the Dust will recognize that motif. So we could not ignore, it's a community development, economic development. We don't use the word reparations because that makes funders nervous, but there is repair here. We've seen farmers in South Carolina cry because they're getting to grow indigo again. So there's healing, there's trauma healing, there's historical healing, there's cultural development. Indigo is very expensive, so we're bringing them in at the top of the market. We paid farmers $20 a pound last summer, which you cannot do with anything other than cannabis. And so it doesn't have all of the issues of cannabis, including the racial discrimination for licenses. But it is based on the idea that it is beautiful. The community is happy that indigo, at the end of the season, we let it bloom so we can collect the seeds. And the community is very happy because we're also growing it on brownfields in the city, that it is pretty and that the dye is pretty. And so the aesthetic experience is very complex here because it's embodied. I mean, they feel something. They're literally staining their bodies. And then artists and makers dye things, and we will sell them and feed that wealth back into the community through an economic structure that I won't go into here. But notice, that is the way aesthetics work. You get a piece of that in other, but when you look at how people do art, live with art, make art, you begin to see its full potential. And many people here know that you get much more or response in the doing of art than in the consumption of art. Consumption of art is very important. I'm not saying that, but it is an important chunk of a larger process.
This image of the hands stained with the blue, and it's indigo is this very rich blue, is really wonderful. I also love this thread of blue cross-culturally being something beautiful, something holy and maybe ineffable in some ways.
Guatemala, what we call South Carolina indigo really came from Guatemala, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, Korea, Japan. Those are the major. And now Baltimore.
Congratulations to Baltimore. I mean, Julio, we've used the words, this is pretty, this is beautiful. And in some ways, the way that the academics on this panel have talked about beauty does feel a little bit different from the way that, people talk about beauty in the real world. Is it just sort of prettiness, or is it just based on desire, the wanting for this rich color, the wanting for this expensive product, or is it something else going on there?
So, for the moment, I'm bypassing that question, but I want to bring the issue of transcendence and beauty. We're at the Catholic University of America, and there is a long tradition in the Catholic faith, but also in many other faiths, and also in philosophy that connects God and beauty. So, just a couple of thoughts on that. This is August 1994. I'm entering the Pantheon for first time. 1997, August, also in Tokyo, enjoying Shinsendo. It's a very small house by some Zen master. June 2007, the Muhammad Ali Mosque in Egypt. And I can continue a couple more of these. Those are moments that I lost myself and I cry like a baby. There was no value attachment at the beginning. I felt in communion with the universe. In some quarter, they call it non-dual experience. I felt definitely an existential realization of liberation and profound transformation within myself. These were all architecture experiences. After these experiences, I conducted a survey and got about 3,000 answers, 1,000 stories of people around the world that had these experiences. And that shows that I'm not the only one that had these amazing things. What beauty could do is amazing. And it can go from social justice and the conversation that we just heard and saw the video to this more profound realizations, all in this continuum. And I think it's something that we often do not acknowledge and we do not talk enough. And I think, of course, we can approach this from so many perspectives as this conference is doing. But to me, this is what I'm very intrigued about, this door to the transcendence, perhaps more than to other dimensions. This is just Julio, right? Doesn't mean the other dimensions are not important. But the fact that we could, that this can happen at all, it's just a miracle. It's a true miracle. The question of Kant, Immanuel Kant talked about this interestedness. The fact that in order for you to arrive to this sublime and the positive side of sublimity is the fact that there is no business transaction. I'm not getting this to get something. I am not interested. I'm falling in love for love's sake. In the possibility of being brokenhearted, I open myself, I leap, and I don't know if the net will appear. There's a sense of surrendering, and there is so much to this. There's psychology to it, there is neuroscience to it, there is anthropology to it, there is social justice, there is equity, there is all these things. But I just wanted to bring that issue because I think it's in this campus, we could talk these things and we don't sound so weird, right? But it's so powerful.
Can I tell a story of that miracle?
Please.
There are people in Canada who work with child soldiers, lost boys, with dance. And what happens with child soldiers is that the trauma they've been through helps them dissociate, which is how they can do atrocities with seemingly no emotion. And you can spend years of therapy, and often this is done in association therapy, but they use dance. And we brought them to the University of Maryland. And I said to the faculty member, we have children soldiers in the U.S. And she said, who? And I said, young gang members. And so it took a very long time for me to convince the gang unit to let us have young people come to campus. They tested me in all kinds of ways. And they finally said, we're going to give you the girls because they're way tougher than the boys. And so, the young women came in, and one of the largest in physicality women, and I won't use the word she used, but she made it very clear that she considered herself to be the toughest woman in the room. And so they started working with them, and they said, show me a movement where you have hurt somebody. And this had freaked out the students the day before, but they did it immediately. Now show me a movement, how it felt when someone hurt you. And that was harder. And they ended up making a dance. But this woman had come and sat down, and we had brought in dancers, but we were clear that aesthetically they had to, they had tattoos, they had piercings. The preppy students didn't get to participate in this. So there were aesthetic choices that were very important. And the students have been trained to go and sit down with people who dropped out because it was hard. And eventually she comes back in. They don't ask her to come back in, but she rejoins the group. At the end, they do this dance. And it was Valentine's Day, and I had bought roses. I know, economically not wise, but I bought roses, and I handed them out. And she began to cry, and she hugged me. Now, she walked in threatening, and by the end, and that took an hour and a half. Try to do that any other way, I don't know how.
Anjan, did you want to jump in? Yeah, try and follow that.
It's scary following Sheri on a comment like that. But I did want to get back to something that we talked about in our preparatory meeting, this idea of Sheri's interest in everyday quotidian aesthetics and Julio's and these kind of transcendent, profound experiences, and kind of the range between that. And again, this notion of transcendence and maybe a cousin to that of transformation that you can have in a smaller way, these kinds of transformations that occur, which art can be a vehicle for. And one of the projects we've been involved with is not far from here at Walter Reed Military Medical Center, of using art therapy in people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress symptoms. And it's a national tragedy, I think, in the way that we don't really take care of our veterans after they return. It also turns out that art therapy has never really been subjected to any kind of rigorous study. And in this project, we have people doing self-portraits on a blank paper mache mask at the beginning of the intervention, and after an 8-week period, redoing that and getting back to notions of ineffable. It turns out that for many people in this situation that are traumatized, have a very hard time putting into words what their experience and their internal state is, but they find they can do something as a self-portrait, an emotional self-portrait that ends up being enormously powerful. And then they can talk about it. Once it's externalized, they can talk about it. And these expressions, when you read their descriptions, are very powerful. And at least one gets the sense of a kind of transformation, might not reach the point of transcendence in the way, Julio, you're thinking about. But again, in a smaller way, it seems as though in this case, expressivity is an important piece of what art can do. And it is a vehicle that we're finding seems to make a difference.
I want to turn to you actually, because now we're talking about objects. I mean, whether it's a self-portrait or a mask or something. How do these everyday objects hold beauty and function as meaning makers for us? And you talked a little bit about form versus function. Are there ways that you can try to infuse both? Do you sometimes just favor one side over the other for aesthetic purposes?
Yeah, I think, with objects or art, there's also value or meaning that you attach to it, right? So I could have an object at home which is very dear to me because it's an heirloom piece, or it's something that I found on a trip with my little boys, and it's just a piece of stone, but it has so much meaning to me. And, that's why I'm so interested in Anjan's work. And, a lot of the conversations yesterday about what is the truth of beauty, it's about the meaning and value we attach to it. It was interesting what, Julio, you were saying about walking into the Pantheon. I have never felt that with a man-made structure. I've never, ever, and I tried, okay? I walked to every beautiful piece of architecture because I am an architect, but I've only ever felt that transcendence in nature. Because for me, nothing in nature is perfect. And, us as humans, there is so much perfection attached to these buildings or these structures that we make. Not a screw out of place. We're so OCD. And I'm all of those things, which is why whenever I'm on a trek or I'm diving, that's when I transcend, because I'm seeing, I don't believe in God, but I'm seeing something that is bigger than me, in front of me. And it takes me to a different dimension, whatever dimension that is. I find it interesting that you find it in man-made structures and I can't see it. So yeah, for me, objects, it's all about value. It's about meaning. It's about what value and meaning you attached to that building when you walked in. And again, with, the therapy work that you're talking about, it's so powerful because this is beauty creating change, creating transformation. But it's because your work is so meaningful and powerful. And that's why it's creating all that change. Do you know what I mean? So you as a human is bringing beauty into that situation rather than it being an object or a place or, a moment in time.
One of the most interesting sort of popular art and beauty phenomenons that I've been following over the past few years is the new familiarity that Americans have with the Japanese tradition of wabi-sabi.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Explain what that is. You'll be better than I.
But that just goes back to what I was saying. There is nothing perfect in nature. And that's what wabi-sabi is. It is finding these imperfect objects and finding the beauty in them. And it's almost kind of, all of us are imperfect, right? There is nothing perfect about any of us. I can think of a million flaws that I have, but I can appreciate myself in that imperfection. And sometimes I feel like, people think about this pursuit of beauty as being superficial. And I kind of have to agree with them. Because sometimes finding that rough around the edges, which is what wabi-sabi is, or finding something and accepting it for what it is beautiful. Like you said, that tough lady with the tattoos. Of course she's beautiful, but maybe not in an aesthetic sense of this balance, symmetry, and all these things that I seek, and order that I seek in architecture. But in her being, she's beautiful, So I think, yeah, I'm a huge fan of wabi-sabi. I just think everyone should just be like themselves for who they are and objects for what they are as well.
For those in the audience who aren't as familiar with this practice, it is kind of the art of making sort of broken things whole through art. And sort of the best known manifestation of this is bowls, like pottery that has been shattered and then it's put back together and the cracks are filled with sort of the grout is made of gold, actually. So instead of hiding the cracks in the art or the objects, you see it highlighted in this this powerful and expensive and sort of wonderful configuration.
But Christine, I kind of want to throw it back to you, right? You wrote this book, Rethinking Sex, which is about human beauty. And I think you argue in the book that, meeting people on dating apps is casual. It doesn't lead to a meaningful relationship. I'd really like to hear you talk about that, because what is meaning, if it's not that human beauty? Because when you're on a dating app, you are just judging person on one dimension, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I thought that being the moderator meant that I didn't have to answer any questions. Never escape.
Work like equity.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And that actually goes back to what Sheri was saying about how we assign value to beauty. Really, I'm just talking about a lot of things I dislike this morning. Not beauty, but the metaverse and dating apps. Maybe technology is the connector here. I find dating apps and the way that they highlight beauty a bit pernicious, because they tend to, only give you sort of the visual of someone. You see someone's picture maybe a couple words of text, and you have to make a split-second decision on that. And then there's the way that we as humans, and especially young people who are shaped by media, shaped by representation, often have these ideas of what is beautiful, these very stereotypical ideas of what is beautiful that they rely on and then perpetuate as they use dating apps. So, we tend to go for the blonde person, say, or, the person who's at least 6 feet tall, or these really stereotypical renderings of what is commonly sold to us as beauty. And we value those people, or those people see a lot of success in the dating market that's only image based. And that leaves a lot of people out, but also leaves a lot of kinds of beauty out. And then, Anjan, I think probably you can talk a little bit more about this. As you continue to do this, you're continuing to swipe through people, picking based on a few concepts. You're sort of training yourself. You're training your brain to only appreciate a certain look or a certain person or people under a certain age. And then when that's reflected in our society, in the way that we have historically valued one type of beauty over the other, one race over the other, one sex over the other, you can continue to perpetuate some really ugly stereotypes.
Yeah, this is a very rich area of conversation. It actually goes back to the 1860s. Francis Galton, many of you know, was a brilliant polymath. He was an anthropologist, a statistician, an explorer. He also was a eugenist, and at a time where the term didn't quite have the same meaning that it took on afterwards. But he was giving an address, which you can find, it's fantastic, where he's talking about bringing to bear a new technology on a social situation. The new technology was photography. And his idea was that if he could take photographs of convicted felons and combine them, he would create the prototypic face of a criminal, right? So, all of our concerns about a surveillance state, but this was the idea. And he genuinely thought, okay, let's see what the physiognomy of the criminal person is. To his surprise, what he finds at the end of that is when he does this, that the images that come out of this are more beautiful than any of the individual faces that contributed to the combination. And this is an experimental finding that has been replicated many times, which is if you average across a diverse kind of faces, the face that comes out of it is more attractive, almost always, than any of the individual faces that contributes to it. So now 2 implications of that, which is that we are constantly building prototypes. We are doing the averaging in our brain without realizing it based on what we are exposed to. So if you grow up in a multicultural or a cosmopolitan place like DC or New York or Philadelphia or London, any major city, you have a much richer sense of the kinds of beauty that one might have, as opposed to if you just grow up in an environment that is monocultural. And now to take your point with social media, if you're just looking through TikTok or Instagram at these impossible standards of beauty that are filtered, that's also part of how you're forming these prototypes, and it completely distorts standards of beauty.
That makes so much sense. That's also rather alarming for, I think, the younger among us, especially any of us who have kids or teenagers.
Yeah, if I can, just one quick point about that is that since especially 2012, which was an inflection point, the rates of depression and suicide in teenagers has skyrocketed. And it almost correlates very closely with the use of social media. And at least one explanation for this is exactly this kind of comparison. It's especially true for young girls between the age of 10 and 14. And it looks as though this kind of comparative thing has a profound effect on people's self-esteem because these standards of beauty are put forth. So I think what you're saying is actually we're seeing the consequences of that for about the last 10 years.
So there really is that empirical evidence. Wow, this is so rich. We only have a few more minutes left. So I wanted to give you all a chance to, if you have just a final statement you want to say about beauty at work and any of the many ways that we've talked about it this morning, or where you're thinking you might take this in your research.
Well, one thing I want to say is that beauty is always at work, whether we are aware of it or not. So it's not that we need to infuse work with beauty or beauty with work. It's happening, as Anjan just, I think, made very clear, happening all the time, all around us anyway. And that's an important thing for us to know. We make all kinds of decisions based on aesthetic information. As he said, beauty, truth, intelligence. I mean, all of those things that have nothing to do with the abstraction of beauty, that we're constantly using it. There are studies that showed when word processing on computers that you could take the exact same paper that was, when I was in college, you were using whiteout, right? And you could have a typed paper with whiteout and one that was word processed.
Well, I want to explain what whiteout is because
yes, for the younger whippersnappers in the room, you would type, and then if you made a mistake, because it was ink, you couldn't erase it. So it was white paint paste and a little brush, and you would paint over it, let it dry, like go type some more and let it dry, and then type over it again. So it had a Band-Aid on it in a way. So you get these papers with these little patches. And when more fluent students began to get ones that looked like all of our papers do now, there was a period where they were doing studies and found that the exact same content that was pretty was getting higher grades. So it's not just people, it's all around us that we make these collapsing of beauty and truth and beauty and what we've, I think, added on is that what we perceive as beauty, depending on where we are and who we are, is so we're making these decisions all the time.
I'm not a researcher, but I read somewhere that if you work in a space that is 10 feet high, your creativity goes up. And I think, Anjan, you wrote about this, about, the volume of the space. So I've just moved my entire team into a massive space. So I'll let you know the results of that if creativity is actually on the up. So that's what I'm doing next.
One of the good things about AI that is transforming, and it will transform everything within 6 months to a year, if not less. And in the context of everything we're talking about, social media, also the Zoom and all that, is that you will not be able to believe anything anymore unless you are present. I mean, you won't be able to believe anything. And to me, that brings back reality to a level of embodiment and of this, that actually makes our life more real than ever. And architecture, perhaps, and the arts even more relevant, and social interaction more real than ever. To me, that's a fantastic development, despite all the spin negative that we hear. To me, that's a positive development. We had to have some positive development. The other thing I want to say just quickly is that going back to this sense of, crying with architecture, right? I believe architecture changes people. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be an architect. And that I choose to be voluntarily naive. And that's why I do some research trying to prove it. But the other aspect of this is that all of us that try to pray or meditate, we know how hard it is to get to that point in which you could be really open, right? What architecture or the arts and the beauty of music does is produce that effect without effort. You go to that place without effort because the object or the space or the art is so powerful that consumes all your attention. So the frontal cortex doesn't have to make any effort anymore to bring attention back, but you are catapulted in this state of complete presence. So that's a very powerful thing to add to the conversation.
Then want to round us out?
I think what over the next few years I'm excited about, this touches on previous comments, is the kind of phenomenology, which Julio is very interested in, the first person experience, the kind of embodied experience, the hand and the indigo, the being in nature, this kind of first person experience, and the program as a scientist, which is always about third person accounts. And how do we bring those together? And so this idea of what is the connection between qualitative first person accounts and quantitative descriptions of those accounts in a way that we can actually do some science on. And in an ironic way, while AI is going to really mess us up in many ways, it also, I think, has the potential to bridge this gap. And we're particularly interested, again, how do we get phenomenology, first-person qualitative accounts mapped onto third-person quantitative accounts? And we might start to have the technology to begin to do that and combine with physiologic measures. So over the next 5 years, that's what I'm excited about that might happen in our field.
So it seems a good place for us to leave off right now is thinking about beauty at work as actually being beauty lived, beauty embodied. And that may be where we've always been, but also where we're going next. And I think that's where you'll all be going next in the various panels and discussions that you're headed to. But please just give a round of applause for this great and fascinating panel.